This lecture is over Chapter 11, Personality and the Self. So Hazel Marcus, a Stanford University professor, conducted a study in which her research team recruited two groups of people from the waiting areas at the San Francisco airport. Now, the first group was made up of people who had been born in America and who spoke English at home. The second group was made up of people who were born in either Korea or China, were citizens of those countries, and primarily spoke Chinese or Korean. Each of these people were asked to fill out a brief survey in exchange for a pen as a gift. They were permitted to choose from a selection of pens. Most of them were orange and a few were green. Now, 3/4 of the Americans chose green, the least common color. For example, if there were 2 green pens and 10 orange pens, the Americans would choose green. Now, the students from Korea and China, on the other hand, they displayed a different pattern. The vast majority opted for the most common color in the selection of pens, avoiding the rarer color. Now, what this shows is that our behavior reflects a deep cultural characteristic where Americans tend to seek uniqueness in their personality and East Asians tend to seek more sameness in their personality. So what are we talking about when we talk about personality? Well, it's a stable set of behavioral and experimental characteristics of an individual. And it's been found that actually defining personality has been a very challenging task in psychology. And that's because personality is largely a theoretical concept. And so what happens is we then have to kind of define the things that go around this theoretical concept, and we have to look at reasons behind why we are defining personality this way. So in this case, in psychological practice, we use 3 reasons to define personality. The first has to do with consistency. And this is where our personality concept helps psychologists establish consistency in an individual's observable characteristics. And then based on that, we're able to then make predictions regarding that person's behavior. So an example of this, a sociable and outgoing person that lives in Mexico is expected to have those same features when they move to the United States. Now, the second reason involves the practical value of the personality concept, referring to the causation of behavior. So personality as a concept indicates that an individual's behavior, feelings, or thoughts are not just direct responses to external stimuli. So basically with this one, a generally shy person from a small town is likely to be reluctant to take risks in most new situations. And then finally, the third reason has to do with organization. People tend to display thousands of seemingly unrelated characteristics. So the systematic approach that's been utilized in psychological studies of personality helps psychologists then kind of delineate an individual's few salient or related qualities. So basically, a deeply religious person is likely to have several other features that are going to correspond to their religiosity. And when we talk about personality, we can't continue on without talking about personality traits. And personality traits are going to be those distinguishable displays or patterns of behavior and experience. Now, when talking about personality traits, the big 5 dimensions, or the 5-factor model, it's called both, has become the most popular model of trait dimensions. And what this is the main postulate is that 5 dimensions are needed in order to adequately map the domain of personality. Now, the 5 factors are labeled as follows, and these are kind of the way they've been represented in your book. However, if you reorganize them, you actually, if you notice, and I'll use my cursor here, you can spell out ocean. So they're supposed to be in this order: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, so that it spells out OCEAN, or ocean, which makes it much, much easier to remember the 5 factors. Now, when talking about cross-cultural research in terms of personality, it's mainly addressed 2 questions. The first is whether there is universal validity of the 5-factor model, or if universal validity of the 5-factor model can be established. So if the 5 dimensions can represent basic differences in individual functioning, they then should be able to be replicated everywhere. Now, if they are characteristic of U.S. Americans, different cultures and languages are still likely to show the same or other trait configurations of the 5-factor model. Now, the second is whether differences in score levels exist across cultures on these various dimensions, and if so, what do these dimensions or these differences mean? So in general, what we have found is that the 5-factor model, the 5 dimensions of the 5-factor model, have been found and have been identified originally in the US, are also found to be elsewhere, including in non-Western societies. So one of the first attributes that we have to look at, in addition to the 5-factor model when talking about personality, is national character. Because national character is going to play a huge part in our personality as well as our features and the self, how it kind of makes us us. So when we talk about national character, this is a perceived set of predominant behavioral and psychological features and traits that are going to be common in most people of the same nation. Now, there's a lot of views of national character that are enshrined in literature, that are embedded in various interpretations of history, or disseminated through jokes, perpetuated by travelers' tales. So in addition to that, what happens is we have factors that affect those stereotypical perceptions, those jokes, those travelers' tales that are related to national character. And this is in table 11.1 in your textbook. So the first are specific events. Specific events play a very real thing in making a person a person. So think about wars between 2 countries, serious international incidents where it generates an aggressor image that are attached to people of a particular nation. And this aggressor image can be attached even many years after the end of open hostilities. So think about World War II. Many years after World War II, even sometimes still now, Germans and Japanese have to contend with a negative stereotype that others hold toward them. Think about after 9/11. We still have people that are Muslim of the Islam faith that still have to deal with them being the aggressor, even though they had nothing to do with 9/11, and 9/11 was completely a factor of extremists. The other factor that affects these stereotypical perceptions is a history of oppression. So lasting colonialist policies, other examples of a country's domination, or even exploitation of another country is going to frequently produce mutual antagonistic perceptions. So right now we have the Ukraine-Russia I don't want to say war, but struggle going on in Eastern Europe. And what's going to happen is it's going to have lasting policies. There are going to be some type of stereotypical perception that's going to fall on top of both Ukraine as well as Russia. Then we have wealth and poverty. So people of wealthy countries, they are commonly perceived by people in poor, especially poor neighboring countries, as egotistical and mean, while people in poorer nations are usually stereotypically dismissed by some as lazy and dirty. Now, obviously, these stereotypical perceptions aren't real, but they are a perception. They are a perception from other people. So this is table 11.2 from your book, and it looks at the drawbacks and the disadvantages of both Western individualism and non-Western collectivism. And I'm not going to go through this, but I want to make sure that you all really take a look at these drawbacks and disadvantages, because for the most part throughout the semester, we've talked about the advantages of individualism, the advantages of collectivism. We haven't really looked at the disadvantages or the drawbacks of each of those. So make sure you definitely take a look at these, at the different drawbacks and how they kind of compare to one another. So we've talked about personality. Now we have to talk about the self. So what exactly is the self? Well, it's what refers to a representation of a person's identity or the subject of experience. So it's basically, again, it's everything that makes you you. Now, psychologists, they generally accept that the self comes into being at the interface between a person's inner biological processes and their eco-cultural context. And people often make distinctions between the world within them and then the world outside of them. So both of these internal and external worlds shape our self-perception in a variety of ways that can reflect the most prominent characteristics of a culture in which we live. And that leads to a person's self-esteem. And a person's self-esteem reflects a person's general subjective evaluation, both emotional and rational, of his or her own worth. So self-esteem was examined in a study in more than 600 United States and Chinese college students. What was found was that the study revealed Chinese participants were lower in perceived self-competence, but they were higher in self-liking than the United States students. So what happens is the authors argued that in collectivist cultures, which require sensitivity to the needs of others, as well as subordination of personal goals to collective needs, it is expected then that individuals will develop self-liking. In individualistic cultures, independence and the self are what tend to be more prioritized. So one of the most popular hypotheses that's derived from cross-cultural research on self-perception is an idea about the existence of what we call the private self versus a public self. So the private self, this indicates feelings and thoughts about oneself for oneself. So it's what we feel inside of ourselves. The public self is the concept of self in relations to others for others. So what this means is our public self is what we show other people, and sometimes they're very different. So what's been found is people from collectivistic cultures, they tend to produce a more group-centric description of their self than people from individualistic cultures. And so they tend to identify their self not as an independent entity, but rather as part of a particular social group. Whereas, on the other hand, US subjects describe themselves in a number of abstract traits that are relatively unrelated to particular social groups. So it just kind of shows how we tend to see that public self versus that private self. When we're talking about self, we have to talk about gender. We have to talk about gender as a social construct because it does play a huge part. Now, when we talk about gender and we talk about sex, sex is a category that's rooted in biological, physiological, anatomical factors. So we're talking about sex is when it's in psychology, when we refer to the sex of something, it is what you are born with or what you have right now. So either the biological or the anatomical. With gender, this is going to be very complex because now we're looking at features that are a set of behavioral features, cultural features, psychological features that are usually associated with an individual's sex, but not necessarily all the time. So we have to look at gender as a concept. And when we look at gender as a concept, it has a significant cultural component. So we tend to look at it as the state of being male or female, but what happens is it is determined more by informationally prescribed cultural norms. So the customs, the expectations, or even the legal rules or the law that mandate or prohibit particular actions. Now, for a lot of people, they see gender as a social category, in which case it can be viewed as internal or external. The internal is going to be a dimension that's going to refer to the degree of experiencing of being male or female. So this is where we're going to see kind of that gender role of masculinity or femininity. And the internal is what leads to that gender identity. So that individual's self-determination or self-reflection as being male, female, intersex, or neither. And studies have shown that for most of us, gender identity will remain stable. But as we all know, it can change. Now, the external dimension is a dimension that refers to the roles that society assigns to each sex. So these are interconnected and they tend to actively interact with one another. And that's kind of what leads us to our gender roles. So when we talk about gender roles, when an individual learns about or identifies with a particular gender, the process involves understanding, evaluating, and accepting particular patterns of behavior. So what happens is we have these gender roles. And what gender roles are is it's the prescriptions and the expectations that are assigned to genders on a female-male continuum. So think of basically a spectrum. So put a line across and we can go from one end all the way to the other or be anywhere in between. Now, across most cultural groups, the two major clusters are masculine and feminine. So we can fall anywhere on that spectrum in terms of masculinity and femininity, regardless of our gender. So masculinity traditionally is assigned to men. It's traditionally a general set of features associated with physical strength, decisiveness, assertiveness. Whereas femininity is traditionally assigned to women and is a general set of features that's correlated with beauty, emotionality, and nurture. But like I said, you can fall anywhere on the spectrum that you want. So it is very possible that there is, let's go with a female athlete who by day continually trains, very assertive, has a lot of physical strength, so technically would fall under masculinity, but at the same time by night likes to dress very feminine, put on dresses, do their hair, whatever the case may be. So you don't have to fall under one or the other. And you can basically be in different areas on that spectrum in the same day. So contemporary psychology does not limit gender roles to a dichotomous female-male category. Instead, we view it as individuals having many features of both masculinity and femininity. And then finally, religious identity. Religious identity definitely has to be looked at in terms of the self. And what this is the sense of belonging to a religion and the importance of this group membership that is relevant to that individual's sense of self. So one view that has significant cross-cultural applicability involves understanding religious identity through the prism of believing, emotionally bonding with knowledge, acting, and then belonging. Now, when we talk about believing, this is where every religion has developed a wide range of beliefs about God or the gods, their power, their actions, their connections with human beings. So in general terms, believing involves accepting that something more larger, more powerful, and more knowing than a human being exists. But it's not just about the beliefs. It's also about the bonding or the connection of the individual with the higher beings, with the religious teaching symbols, with other people. So bonding tends to be practiced and experienced through prayer and meditation in both private and public settings. We then have the acting. This is the religious identity that includes moral actions. It's how we act on an everyday basis. So religious teachings tend to provide specific moral arguments, and they tend to define right and wrong from a particular religion's perspective. And then finally, the belonging. Now, this feature is usually very easy to observe in a person's actions, in the way they dress, the food they eat, the food they don't eat, as well as the ceremonies and practices that they tend to participate in. This is the end of chapter 11. If you have any questions, as always, please do not hesitate to reach out.